It's time to buckle in because you just stumbled upon what very well might be the very best video that you have ever watched on the ridiculousness of the theory of macroevolution. My name is Andrew Bahari. I'm a deacon of the Coptic Orthodox Church, and I'll be approaching this topic from two angles. The very first angle is how, as a Christian, you cannot believe in macroevolution and the theory of evolution and the Bible at the same time. You have to pick. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. Either one is true and the other is false, or one is false and the other is true. And the second angle I'll be taking with this topic is a purely logical one, where even if you weren't a Christian, you would be able to understand how ridiculous the theory of evolution is. And the outline of this video, the agenda for this video, is going to be 5 main points. The first big point is I'll be talking about how science was something that emerged in medieval Christian Europe and why that's the case and why it didn't emerge anywhere else. The second thing I'll be talking about is how the theory of evolution fundamentally contradicts Christian doctrine. That you can't have this theistic evolution where you believe in the Christian God and the Christian Bible and evolution at the same time, because some people, they try to do this. The third thing we'll be talking about is this agnosticism of Christians, where they'll say, I'm agnostic about the idea of evolution. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. Oh, I don't know. I'm agnostic about it. I don't find the question interesting to begin with. But it's an important question, because if evolution is true, then our religion is false. And if our religion is true, then the theory of evolution is false. The fourth thing I'll be talking about, are the logical flaws in the theory itself, and why, even from just a purely logical point of view, evolution makes no sense, and it's ridiculous to believe in this theory. And the last thing I'll be talking about is evolutionary psychology in particular, and how evolutionary psychology is inadequate in explaining human behavior. So first things first, let's talk about why science emerged out of Christian Europe. Arguably, the best scientist who has ever lived, Newton, was a devout Christian. Kepler, devout Christian. The father of modern empiricism himself, Francis Bacon, was a devout Christian. And it is Francis Bacon who was really fundamental in the formulation of what we now know as the modern scientific method. And the reason why it was these men in this place at that time from whence modern science sprung out of, and not the Middle East or not the Far East, the reason why it was where Christianity was predominant and dominant and flourishing, is because Christians think about the world in a unique way. Christians believe that there was a God who made the world ex nihilo, which means out of nothing. Christians believe that God is separate from his creation. They're not the same thing. Christians also believe that we, as humans, are all separate. I am me. I am not you. We are not the same person. I am not this microphone. You are not this microphone. This camera is not this microphone, the camera I'm talking into. Everything is a separate entity. And you might tell me, oh, well, Andrew, isn't that obvious? Of course we're separate entities. Why wouldn't we be separate entities? And the reason you might be saying that is because you, whether you're Christian or you're not, if you grew up in the West, you have inherited the worldviews, the fundamental worldviews, the way in which you see the world from your Christian heritage of your ancestors. Because this isn't always the case in every place in the world. If you take a look at India, for example, in India, they have this concept known as samsara. What is samsara? Samsara means illusion. And samsara implies that every difference we see is really an illusion. The difference between you and I is an illusion. The difference between me and this microphone is an illusion. The difference between you and me and God are all illusions. I'm kind of thirsty. 1 second. I'm actually recording this video for a second time because the first time my audio was botched, and so my throat is getting a little sore here. Give me a second. Okay. So in India, since they have this idea of samsara, that everything is separate from everything else, only as an illusion, they, of course, want to remove this illusion. They want to return to fundamental reality. They want to learn more about what's really true. And the way you would do that in India, in the pagan practice of Hinduism, is you would have to remove this illusion. Now, how do you remove this illusion? How do you remove the samsara? You cross your legs, you close your eyes, and you try to attain nirvana, otherwise known as enlightenment. That's how. You don't go out there and you try to better understand the creation, because the better you understand the handiwork of the creation, the better you can understand the creator. One of the ways you can understand the creator is by studying his handiwork. They don't have that concept. The way you understand the creator is by removing the samsara. So you sit down and you don't conduct science and you meditate instead. And then some people might say, well, Christianity isn't the only religion that thinks that God created the universe ex nihilo and that God is separate from the universe. What about a religion like Islam, for example? The thing about Islam is Islam has a lot of schools of thought. And some of the more fundamental ones have this concept of occasionalism. And occasionalism is this belief that cause and effect are really just an illusion. Where if I take a bundle of wood and I light it on fire, what's really happening in that instance, there's no natural law, there's no combustion with oxygen. What's really happening here is that in that instance, God is willing the bundle of wood to get lit. And so there is a replacement of natural laws, such as the laws of physics, such as the laws of chemistry, such as things like gravity. And it's replaced with this perpetual willing of God in every single instance. And while in Christianity, we do believe that things can only happen if God wills them to happen, we also believe in natural laws. This isn't a stand-in, that God created the universe and he placed in it natural laws that occur naturally. And since that's the case, science was able to emerge where people thought that they can become closer to the truth by studying things scientifically as one of the ways. Now you might ask me, okay, well, Andrew, if that's the case, then why didn't science emerge from somewhere like the Middle East, where it all began, where Jesus was born and lived? The reason why is because for about the past 1,300 years, the Middle East has been occupied by Muslims. And also Islam, not only does it sometimes have this occasionalism, it also is typically preoccupied with things like military conquest, and it has a different focus. And now that some Middle Eastern Christians have immigrated to other countries such as the UK or such as Germany or such as America, a lot of them are some of the world's greatest renowned scientists and engineers, the Christian ones, right? And so that's why it didn't happen in the Middle East. And so with this foundation, now we can move on to the second big pillar of this video, which is why evolution fundamentally contradicts Christian doctrine. And the crux of this issue is that in Christianity, we know that death did not enter into the world until the fall of man. The problem with the theory of macroevolution is that there was death before there was man. Let's quickly recap the theory of evolution. You have a species, let's say us, Homo sapiens, humans. Humans evolved from a more primitive primate through generations and generations of changes and adaptations. It didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly and over time. Every generation was just a little bit different than the one before it, and go enough times and have enough generations occur, and eventually way down the line, you end up with a different species. If that were the case, that would mean that death would have had to existed before the emergence of Homo sapiens. And if death existed before the emergence of Homo sapiens, then the Bible wouldn't make any sense. And let's put aside the Genesis narrative for a second, because some Christians like to believe, it's trendy to believe nowadays, that the Genesis narrative is purely allegorical, and there's nothing wrong with interpreting the Bible through a mystical lens or an allegorical sense. But when it comes at the expense of the more fundamental interpretation of the Bible, especially of Genesis, as history, as literal, that's when we run into these issues. And putting Genesis aside, even if you just look at the New Testament, you take a look at Romans. Paul says in Romans 5:12, he says that death entered into the world through the fall of Adam. There could not have been death before the fall of Adam. And if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that by man, lowercase m, death came into the world. But through man, uppercase M, in reference to Jesus, we were redeemed through resurrection. Death was conquered. And so evolution requires death to have existed before Adam. But if you're a Christian, you can't believe that, because even the New Testament, Jesus himself says that it was God who directly created man. If you take a look at Mark 10:6, Jesus says that at the beginning of creation, God created them male and female. God created them male and female. He didn't create a bacteria that then evolved into a fish, that then evolved into a primate, that then evolved into male and female. No. Jesus says that God created them male. He created them female. Jesus says this. And also, in the New Testament, there's a lot of reference to the second Adam. The second Adam, of course, is a reference to Christ. And there could not be a second Adam unless there was a first Adam. Therefore, the thread of the entire Bible, the redemptive arc of the Bible, where you have the fall of man that eventually leads into Jesus's conquering of death through his death, would make no sense if death existed before man existed. And it's trendy nowadays to fence it. It's trendy nowadays to say, I don't know, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Does it really even matter? Someone like Jonathan Pageau says this. He says it's kind of irrelevant whether or not there's a theory of evolution or not, because either way, it doesn't matter, but it absolutely does. And I just demonstrated why. Because you don't have a Christianity if you have a grand theory of evolution. You'll say things like, oh, it's not a really interesting question. That's baloney. It's a fundamental question. It's important that we stomp this out. And someone like Jordan Peterson might say, well, the Bible is myth. It's true myth, he'll say. Capital T, true myth. But it's still myth. And he speaks in this obfuscated way, in this obscure way, about the narratives of the Bible. But you know what I don't hear him talking about that like? He doesn't talk that way about the theory of evolution, the story, the narrative, the ethos, the mythos, I should say, of evolution. He doesn't talk about it that way. But the biblical stories, that's myth. This evolution thing, that's just fact. That's just literal fact. That's what he'll say. Why? Why is it that smart people come to these conclusions? Well, let's be honest. Someone like Peterson is an academic. And in academia, there's this huge social pressure to kind of fit in. And there's this huge stigma around not believing in the theory of evolution. If you're a creationist on a college campus, at least when I was growing up, that means you're dumb. People don't even question it. There's no discussion about it. There's no debate about it. If you are a serious intellectual, quote unquote, and you believe in creationism as opposed to the grand theory of evolution, then you're an idiot. That's sort of the zeitgeist, the spirit of these universities. And this is also true across the country in various pockets of American civilization and Western civilization. And universities kind of pre-select academics to think a certain way, where I've heard it time and time again. There are academics who might have a theory that goes against the popular theory of the current state of academia or of the universities. Maybe it's a more Christian-inspired theory. Then what typically happens is their thesis isn't accepted, they're critiqued harshly, and then they're kicked out of the program. So there's a pre-selection where if you want to become a PhD in a lot of these secular institutions, typically you're going to have to kiss the ring, you're going to have to bow the knee, you're going to have the same fundamental ideas about reality as the institution in which you exist. And of course, there are some institutions, especially Christian institutions, that don't have this problem. But I don't exactly know how it is nowadays, right now at this moment. But when I was growing up, that was definitely the case. But neutrality is impossible on the subject. You cannot be neutral about it. We have to choose a side because there's no communion between these two ideas. And it's important here, before I get into the logical dismantling of the theory of evolution, to make a distinction between macroevolution and microevolution. If you're watching this, you probably already know the difference. But in case you don't, macroevolution, the thing that's specific about macroevolution is the idea of cross-species evolution, that one species, through enough generations and enough time, can eventually morph into another species. Where if you have microevolution is something you could observe in a petri dish. If you have a petri dish and you put it under a microscope and you have a bacterial culture in there, that bacterial culture, since bacteria die so quickly, and they replicate so quickly, you can see certain adaptations occur in bacteria. You can also see this with humans. It's reasonable to observe humans and say, oh, gee, well, the humans over in Europe, they're a lot lighter skinned because they have a lot harsher winters with a lot less sun. But the closer you get to the equator, the darker skin gets. And the Middle Easterners, their skin's a little bit darker than the Europeans, but it's not so dark as the sub-Saharan Africans. To say that as a species that isn't turning into another species, there are minor adaptations here and there, is reasonable. But macroevolution, cross-species evolution, is not reasonable, and let's examine the reasons why. One argument that the experts, the scientists will give for macroevolution is they will take a look at a species like the whale, and they'll say, oh, well, gee, look, whales have hip bones. But why do whales have hip bones? Fish don't have hip bones. Do they need hip bones to swim? I don't think they need hip bones to swim. If they needed hip bones to swim, then why don't fish have hip bones? Therefore, they will say that the whale must have been a land animal. And the land animal had legs, and it had lost its legs. And now it exists in the ocean. And if you wait a couple, tens of thousands more of years, then eventually it will lose its hip bones as well. But recent research shows that the reason why whales have hip bones is for male reproduction, because there are large muscles associated with the functioning of the whale penis that are required to be attached to the hip in order to have reproduction occur in whales. So there's actually a very useful reason why whales have hips. And it's such a non sequitur. You see how they're working backwards. If you see a whale and you see it has hips, you make up an entire story. You literally make up an entire story of why it has hips. You make up this whole thing. And they have these non sequiturs in other ways as well. They'll say things like, oh, well, gee, humans are so similar to some of the other primates. Look at chimpanzees. Look at bonobos. Look at apes. They have 2 hands with 5 digits on each hand, and 2 feet with 5 digits on each foot, and they have a head and a torso. Gee, they kind of look like humans. They'll even say things like, oh, we share 99% of our DNA with these other primates. Wow, we're so similar. Therefore, and here's the mistake they make, therefore, we must have had a common ancestor. How? How did we get from similarities to a common ancestor? That would be like saying, oh, well, gee, take a look at the pyramids of Egypt. Take a look at the pyramids of Giza. they kind of look like the Mayan pyramids. Therefore, they must have been made by the same people. Or it's like taking two brands of water. Let's say you have Macy and Pierre, like I have, and then you have Aquafina. And you say, well, gee, there's similarities between these two. They both hold water. They're both in plastic bottles. They must be made by the same manufacturer. It's a complete non sequitur. It's fallacious. It doesn't make any sense. And scientists, as a whole, are not natural observers. This gets a little bit into the philosophy of science, where every scientist has a narrative, an idea of the way the world works fundamentally, and he brings that into his work. There's no such thing as an unbiased scientist. I already gave you an example with someone like Newton and Kepler, where they are approaching their science from this place of better understanding the creation, so they could better understand the creator. Water, 1 second. But if you contrast that with a scientist who has a different mythos, who has a different narrative story of an origin story, really, of the origins of the universe, he's going to approach his science, he's going to approach his hypotheses with this narrative in mind. That's why they'll see things like fossils and be like, oh, gee, that must mean evolution. Or they'll see things like I just said, where we have similarities with primates, and they'll say, oh, well, gee, well, since I already believe in this origin story of the universe that includes this theory of evolution and the Big Bang and all of this, therefore, since there's similarities, it must mean that there is a common ancestor. And if you believe that already, if you already believed in this religion of macroevolution, then it would make sense you might come up with a hypothesis like that and call it a theory. Excuse me. Another argument against the theory of evolution, it's called the irreproducibility. I'm sorry, I'm getting exhausted. This is the second time I'm recording this. The first one was so long. It's called the irreducible complexity argument, where you have an eye. Let's say the human eye. The human eye is complicated. It has a retina. It has a cornea. It has a lens. And since evolution is claimed to happen very slowly with minute adaptations across multiple generations, thousands of generations, things would adapt slowly. You wouldn't have a whole eye crop up at once. You wouldn't have a situation where fish didn't have eyes and then suddenly one fish is born with a mutation that had eyes. That's not the way it works. The way it would work is maybe one fish has a minor mutation. Let's say it has lens but not cornea or retina, or it has some like minor little teeny bump on its face. That little bump or any of those parts of an eye by themselves don't have an evolutionary advantage, because you need the entirety of the eye, the entire complexity of the eye, in order to have sight. But if you don't have sight, then you don't have that evolutionary advantage. And if you don't have that evolutionary advantage, then there's no reason why, from an evolutionary perspective, it would be advantageous to have that mutation. Therefore, that mutation would not permeate into further generations and outcompete the other organisms in its species in the grand competition of life, as they say. There's no gradual advantage to having just a teeny little bump or just a cornea. And so if this theory is so stupid, as I've demonstrated that it is, why do so many people believe this? And the reason why people believe it is because, like I've alluded to, it is a story, it is a narrative, it is a religion, it is a mythos, the same way you have Greek mythology with Zeus and Poseidon and Venus and all of this. And there's a story about the origins of the universe. This also is literally just a story of the origin of the universe. And we also have a story, as Christians, of the origin of the universe. And we have the correct story, where God created the universe ex nihilo, and he made Adam and Eve, etc. But as you see, it's a story. And the same way that people believe religions and they don't question them is the same way that people believe in the theory of evolution and they don't question it. Now, what are some of the factors in play here? Why did this happen? Well, one of the reasons is because of something called authority bias. And this is an appeal to the experts. What this means is, if you don't know about something, Let's say you don't know something about health and you want to learn about health. You might refer to a doctor, maybe a famous doctor, maybe a doctor who is renowned for knowing what he's talking about. He's an authority in his field. And whereas the experts of old might have worn a shamanistic cap or a sheikh gown or a black robe, the experts, the religious authorities of today, have traded in the black gown for the white lab coat. The scientists, the experts, they're authorities, they're the new priests for the modern age, for the secular West. Another reason why people might believe this is because simply everyone else does, especially if you're in an environment like a college, like a academic institution where everyone around you at least proclaims to believe the grand theory of evolution, or at least if they don't, they never say they do because they don't want to be seen as stupid, and you think everyone around you believes this, then you're more likely to believe it too. It's literally just social proof bias. And there's also fear of social consequences where people might think you're stupid or you're weird or you don't fit in if you believe something different from what they believe. You know, all of these factors. Another reason why is because a lot of times what will happen with these experts is they'll parade around with big words like hitherto and juxtaposition, and they will kind of protrude their heads out and they'll look deep in thought. And they will use a lot of these big words to obfuscate, which itself is a big word, but to confuse their point, and so that the layman, the normal person, doesn't understand it. But because they're an expert, since they're an expert, that individual who's confused by all of this obfuscation or using all of these big words or these overly complex arguments that really could have been simplified, but they don't simplify because then you would see that it was wrong. These laymen will say, oh, well, gee, maybe I'm just too stupid to understand this, but that guy, he's really smart. He's the expert after all. So if he believes it, it must be true. And if I act like I don't understand it, then I'll look stupid. So I'll disagree with him. This is how this happens. Water. Plato called these sophists. Sophists are kind of like pseudo-intellectuals. During his day, you had these people parading around who used a lot of these big words, and they looked bold and they looked confident, and maybe they were tall, and they had a lot of this emotional appeal, and they would trick the people. And they weren't being logical. They weren't being seekers of the truth. They just wanted clout. They just wanted aura. And so they would go out there and they would deceive the people. And Plato would call these sophists, fake philosophers. So let's wrap this up by talking about evolutionary psychology. First, let's do a quick recap. The first thing I talked about is the reason why Christianity emerged. The reason why science emerged out of Christian Europe. The second thing I talked about is the theological contradiction between the theory of evolution and the Bible and how you cannot believe in both. You have to believe in one or the other. The third thing I talked about is the issue of fence sitting and being agnostic and thinking you can kind of leave this topic alone and not interact with it. But it's really important to interact with, because if they're right, then we're wrong. So we have to confront it. The next thing I talked about, the fourth thing I talked about, was the logical flaws of the theory of evolution and how, even from a non-Christian perspective, just from a purely logical perspective, it doesn't make any sense. I'm getting exhausted here. And so now the last topic I'm going to talk about is the idea of evolutionary psychology. And I'll start off by telling a little bit about my personal life. I'll give you a personal story. My whole life, I've been really interested in psychology. As a kid, my favorite class in high school was AP Psych. And because I was always interested in psychology, I got into things like marketing and sales by the time I was an adult. And I was reading these textbooks for fun, not even for a class. I was reading these evolutionary psychology textbooks in order to learn even more about psychology. And there were some things in these textbooks that I thought kind of made sense. For example, there's the evolutionary theory of hypergamy, which more or less says that women tend to date upwards. They tend to mate upwards. They tend to look for guys who have more resources, more money, more social status than they have. And I looked around in the world and I said, gee, that seems like it's true. It must be real. And the thing with evolutionary psychology is, even though it might sort of kind of have the right conclusion, the way it got about it totally was not scientific whatsoever. Because the problem with the way that evolutionary psychology works is it starts with the observed behavior, let's say, for instance, hypergamy, which I'll be using as the example for the rest of this section. And they work their way backwards to the why there's hypergamy. They'll say, oh, well, the reason why they'll observe and they'll see, okay, women tend to be or seem to be hypergamous. Debatable, but they seem to be hypergamous. Gee, I wonder why that is. And because they have that presupposition, they already believe that religion, of scientism, of macroevolution, which is a religion, which is mythology, they'll say, oh, well, evolution's true. We're just going to take that as a fact. And so if it's true, and there's hypergamy, the reason why there must be hypergamy is because of evolution. Well, it's because throughout all of these generations, the women who were hypergamous had a better chance of survival and had a better chance of their offspring surviving. And therefore, there was this filtering out of people who weren't hypergamous. And now the only people left are the hypergamous women. But they worked backwards. They started with the observation, and then they went to the theory. Real science doesn't do that. Real science starts with the hypothesis, the question, and then it works its way to the experiments. It collects data, and then it makes observation about the data, and then it reiterates on the hypothesis. I'll explain to you what I mean, okay? Because this is a little abstract. Let's say I have this water bottle, okay? I want to learn more about the world. And so I make a hypothesis, a guess, about the way the world works. And I say to myself that if I let go of this water bottle, what I think will happen is it will fall and drop and hit the ground. Now that I have my hypothesis, I go ahead and I test it. Okay, so my hypothesis was correct. If I take a water bottle and I let go of it, it drops and it hits the ground. So now I can say, gee, well, maybe there's such thing as gravity, or I can then go ahead and conduct the next experiment. It doesn't start at the opposite, where you make an observation like, oh, women are hypergamous, and then we find out, okay, so it must have been because so-and-so, and you make up this whole entire story about it. Let me pick up my water bottle. So another issue with the theory of evolution, as science, and evolutionary psychology in particular, is a lot of these evolutionary psych theories are unfalsifiable, which means you can't prove them to be false. Let's go back to my water bottle example. If I take this water bottle and I say, if I let go of this water bottle, it'll drop, that's falsifiable. Why? Because I can test it. I can let go of the water bottle and then maybe it would float, which would mean my hypothesis is incorrect. Or maybe it would start rising, which would mean that my hypothesis is incorrect. So I can prove my guess wrong. And for science to be science, you have to be able to prove your guess wrong. And if you can't prove your guess wrong, because it's about some grand origin of the human race that allegedly dated back hundreds of thousands of years, then it's not science. It's just a story. It's just a religion. It's just a mythology. And Christianity is a lot better at explaining human behavior anyway. So if we take a look at hypergamy, why, perhaps, do women want to mate with, date, and marry men who have resources and status? Could it be because, this is crazy, follow me here. Could it be because women in general tend to be more comfortable than uncomfortable? Maybe they want a more cozy life than a harsh life? Gee, isn't that a crazy idea? Isn't that a crazy theory? Could it be, and I'm not saying all women are gold diggers, but could it be that to the extent that gold diggers exist, they exist because they are materialistic? Maybe they're envious of other people. Maybe they are seeking comfort and opulence. No, that couldn't be it. It's because of some grand theory of thousands of years of adaptation and all of this stuff that we're just going to make up. And evolutionary psychology, it can't even really explain the Christian virtues. Take the idea of agape, which means love in Greek, the Christian virtue of love or forgiveness. These things are selfless, but the theory of evolution depends on two main human motivations: the motivation to survive and the motivation to reproduce. And the theory of evolution, would, especially in evolutionary psychology, would suggest that any behavior can be explained through that lens. That any behavior a human does is so that human can survive better, or they could reproduce better. But Christian agape is completely selfless. Christian forgiveness might put you at an evolutionary disadvantage, where forgiving someone might not make it so you have the best absolute chance of survival. And someone of you might say to me, well, Andrew, things like love, things like forgiveness in one's heart, these things aren't observable. How do I know that there's no such thing as selflessness, that people can love completely selflessly? Well, you don't have to, because there are some other virtues that are very empirically observable. Take the virtue of chastity. There have been stories of saints who were prostitutes, and then they repented, and then they never had sex again. And if, like the theory of evolution suggests, one of the two primary functions of human existence is to reproduce, wouldn't that go against reproduction? You can say, oh, it's a little bit abstract. What about martyrdom? We have, even in the last decade, instances that we could reference of Christians going out of their way to affirm Christ, even if it means they were led up to death, like the 21 Christian Coptic martyrs. And if it is a fundamental core incentive for a human being to survive, and all behavior can be explained by that incentive, then you would not have a world in which martyrdom and martyrs existed. And this is empirical. We can see it happen. We can see it happen all the time. And so, Christianity and evolution cannot mix. There cannot be any communion between these two ideas because they completely contradict each other. And when you reject evolution, you're not rejecting science, you're rejecting scientism. Real science, like I said, it actually leverages the scientific method, and it has theories that are falsifiable. Whereas scientism, it's this grand mythos, this mythology of how the world came to be and the way humans came to be. And it's the story just like the stories of Odin are stories, just like the stories of Zeus and Poseidon are stories. And there is one story, one origin story that's correct, and that's a Christian origin story. But all these other ones are, in fact, including scientism, including the theory of evolution, they are just stories. They are just origin stories. And so I invite you for this video to perhaps examine your own life and your own thinking and think, gee, are there any other places in which I am falling prey to social proof bias, where I believe something just because everyone else believes it, or authority bias, where I believe it just because an alleged expert told me that it were true? And if you do this, what you will come to find is that the Christian view is the most coherent explanation for reality, and that macroevolution is absolute nonsense.